It is my pleasure to introduce Work Play today, a St. Louis-based interdisciplinary design and art studio. And I really also just want to welcome you all to this ECCE Speaker Series event today. My name is Allison Lacher. I am the director of the Visual Arts Gallery at UIS, and I will be serving as your moderator today. Your presenters are Danielle McCoy and Kevin McCoy, who together comprise Work Play. Before we get started, I would like to share with you the ECCE Speaker Series learning objectives. Recognize the social responsibility of the individual within a larger community. Practice awareness of and respect for the diversity of cultures and peoples in this country and in the world. Reflect on the ways involvement, leadership, and respect for community occur at the local, regional, national, or international levels. Identify how economic, political, and social systems operate now and have operated in the past. Engage in open-minded and ethical decision-making and action. Distinguish the possibilities and limitations of social change. I would also like to announce that in conjunction with this ECCE Speaker Series event, the UIS Visual Arts Gallery is pleased to be hosting an exhibition by Work Play called The Most Known Unknown. This exhibition will open with a reception on Thursday, February 17th from 5:30 to 8 p.m. and will run through Thursday, March 10th. So please join us for the reception. The artists will be with us, or visit the gallery during the exhibition run. And now I would love to introduce your speakers, Work Play. Work Play is an interdisciplinary design and art studio that was started by Danielle and Kevin McCoy. Their practice spans across several disciplines such as design, printmaking, textile works, and book arts to explore issues of identity, racial inequity, erasure, and redacted histories. Work Play has exhibited at institutions that include the Luminary, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, Volkshochschule Stuttgart Photo Gallery, MCA Denver, O Cinema Wynwood, and Wasaic Project. They have also collaborated with organizations including Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts, Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis, and Aperture Foundation. So please welcome Work Play.
Oh, thank you, Allison, for such a warm and generous introduction. Allow us to share screen here.
Allow us to reintroduce ourselves.
There's a lot of banter that you all have noticed between the two of us. Just see. All righty.
Perfect.
Can everyone see that perfectly clear? Yep.
Great.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you. That's
great.
all we need.
Great.
Well, hello again, everybody. Like I said, allow us to reintroduce ourselves. Again, thank you, Allison, and thank you to the group for having us. We are Work Play. We're an interdisciplinary studio that explores notions of representation, disparities within the American society, and buried histories. And these themes are investigated through like our artist prints, textile works, our publications, and time-based media. So let's get into it. Hold on to your seats. All right, so we feel that buried histories and redacted information have always been inherent in our work. There's a great deal of research that aids in like unearthing a totally different side of history. But before we get into it, let us state that privilege has always been a tool used to divide people. There were specific groups of people that sought to restrict the physical and economic mobility of Black people when they themselves were unknowingly oppressed. So race was implemented to distinguish who had the rights to move to and fro like freely. But in reality, we're all in the same category.
I agree. And, you know, we are collectively bound to a failing and corrupt system. Now, you're probably thinking, what do we mean by that? And to answer that, one would need to dig deeper and do some research about the Nassara Act, You can look up things about fraudulent banking systems, and of course, the meeting at Jekyll Island. Nassau was ruled in favor by the Supreme Court back in 1993, and it was really concerning a lawsuit between the Farmers Union and the Farmers Investment Bank. Now, we've given you the shovels. We'll let you start digging from there.
So we like to start off with this quote from Zora Neale Hurston. If you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it.
Now, in order to talk about our present work, I think it's best to illustrate how we've distilled and woven some of these findings into our previous work. I got to be honest, there's just something tantalizing about hidden information. I mean, and for us, it brings forth even more queries. You know, we've examined how information is parsed or distributed in regards to mass media. And, you know, there's a name for this. It's referred to as framing, whereas mass media will carefully select certain words and images to cover a particular story. And such is the case with Kaepernick and his refusal to stand during the anthem. Now, Kaepernick originally sat during the anthem until he had a conversation with Nate Boyer, who is pictured here on the right. Nate Boyer, as we found out, was a former Green Beret of the U.S. Army Special Forces and also a fellow NFL player. And he wrote an open letter to Kaepernick suggesting that maybe he should kneel instead of sitting down in order to be respectful to those in the military. Now, if you think about what taking a knee means, soldiers often take a knee at a fallen soldier's grave to show respect. So Kaepernick opted to take a knee instead. Although he protested in a respectful manner, he still refused to stand during the anthem, and the public criticism continued. The fact that he was actually paying respect by kneeling was never, ever infused into public discourse. And speaking on, since we're on the subject of respectability for the military and the US flag, does anyone remember this? I do. We both do. It's Kid Rock. He's performing the halftime show at the Super Bowl, and I believe this was back in 2004 between the New England Patriots and the Carolina Panthers. And if you look very closely at the construction of his poncho, you'll notice that it's clearly a flag. What a lot of NFL fans probably don't know is between 2012 and 2015, the Department of Defense spent $6.8 million on what senators call paid patriotism. And this includes flag displays and ceremonies. As recently as 2015, the Department of Defense was doling out millions to the NFL for such things as military flyovers, flag unfurlings, and interestingly enough, national anthem performances. And even though some of these teams performed these ceremonies without compensation from the military, nothing was ever found in their contracts that mandated that players stand during the anthem.
And a bunch of folks were also enraged by his refusal to stand. And I feel like we still kind of hear about that today.
Yeah.
And they demonstrated their dislike by torching or even shooting his jersey, which you can find it on YouTube and the interwebs. And it's almost a protest of the protest. And this doormat that you see here, consisting of an Oakland Raiders jersey of Marshawn Lynch and Colin Kaepernick's jersey, were joined together and taped to the ground as like a makeshift doormat. And it's clear that, you know, they're saying like Lynch, Kaepernick. In my eyes, I look at it as like you've already purchased the jersey and then you still want to go through with these rituals or whatever. I think this was this Missouri?
Yeah, this was outside of the Snafu Bar.
Oh, it's in like in the Ozarks. Yeah, so that was in Missouri. Yeah. So that said, we decided to purchase a real jersey and frame it as sports memorabilia. Oftentimes, many fans, of course, as you all know, will like frame their favorite athlete's jersey because of their accomplishments on the field. Because most times athletes are just reduced to their stats. Black athletes, of course, are definitely not an exception. They're only celebrated for their athletic prowess, but the moment one uses their platform to speak on society's ills, it's like, shut up and dribble or just throw the ball or whatever, right? Even though, in my opinion, I think a lot of doors are starting to open, but for so long, that's how it was.
Still got a long way to go.
Absolutely. So for this piece, we use a torch, like a small jewelry torch, to slightly burn the jersey to reference the opposing protests by NFL fans at large. And then on the outside, we had the smoky tinted plexiglass that was also used to reinforce the conceptual idea.
And we basically wanted to pay homage to this man for sacrificing his livelihood, which is basically what happened, to shed light on these issues that are intertwined in America.
Yeah. Nina Simone, American songwriter, once said, an artist's duty, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times. So as artists, we continue to investigate issues ingrained within our society. And when we think about issues, we also think about the recent cries to justice in the form of protest. So like you saw in the Jersey and other things that we'll get into. And one of the most notable forms of protest dates back to 1968, which we're about to get into. There were a few things to notate that were happening during the period that etched a notch in history. I don't know how many people, hopefully you all are familiar with the Black Power fist that's being hoisted during the 68 Olympics. When we Googled it, this is what we found. Did I go too far?
All right.
Okay, sorry. This is what we found here, and then we'll go forward. So we're really drawn to this logo, which was done by Lance Wyman. He was the designer that created it. This is the brand identity for the 68 Olympics. The creative assets he created for the Olympic Games were deemed pinnacle to modern design. And despite the 68 Olympics and Wyman's wonderful branding, there were a lot of social unrest in 1968 as well, where people flooded the streets in protest against political corruption.
Also, during the 68 medal ceremony at the Summer Olympics, which you see here, African-American athletes Tommie Smith and John Carlos, who staged one of the largest political demonstrations in the Olympic Stadium in Mexico City.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we had an exhibition at Projects Plus Gallery, and I believe this was back in 2017, and we decided to do a series titled When Stars Align, and that basically focused on Black athletes and political demonstrations. And Kaepernick was definitely a hot button at the time, but we started thinking about this new series of works as clusters instead of individual pieces. We began to examine the similarities between the past and the present. Mm-hmm. And we started doing research about the 68 Olympics. We found out a lot about what these two African-American runners, what happened to them, the things that they encountered. And we found this article, which was written by Brent Musburger. I think he's like some sort of sports journalist. And notate, he says he calls both of the athletes black-skinned stormtroopers. And I want you all to really pay attention to the headline. Words are very powerful and their meanings are very loaded. Mm-hmm. And it reads, bizarre protest by Smith Carlos tarnishes medal ceremony. In this two-part work, we chose to pull out that quote from that article written by Brent Musburger, and we silk-screened it directly on top of this archival image using roofing tar as the ink. For our work, OPHR, which stands for the Olympic Project for Human Rights, we printed the wreath from their logo in tar. The American organization was established by sociologists Harry Edwards and others, also including Olympians Tommie Smith and John Carlos. The aim of that organization, of course, was to protest against racial segregation in the United States and beyond, along with racism in the sports in general.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people ask us why we chose to use roofing tar to print the words in the images. We kept it pretty simple. You have to keep in mind that tar, as in tarred and feathered, is a metaphor for severe public criticism. And it's part of the racial epithet, tar baby. This is something, and I'll just say this real quick before you go to the next one. Mm-hmm. We actually were going to frame these open, like with no plexi on the front.
I remember
because I wanted the viewer to be able to walk by and smell the tar as they got close to the work and just kind of understand like where that came and just like evoke other senses as you're also viewing the piece.
I mean, we had an all-out debate about that because I wanted to protect it behind glass and you wanted it to be exposed.
But it was my idea, so I wanted it in. Go ahead.
We began to see a pattern forming, be it through mass media or through the omission of, I guess you can say, historical information. We started examining redaction and aspects of history that were purposefully obscured or omitted altogether.
Yeah, I just find it funny how like droves of FBI files are now becoming declassified. So it's as if like, you know, time has been weaponized. What would happen if that information came out a year after the cover up without being redacted or buried deep? I think back to like even when Michael Brown Jr. was shot here in Ferguson, Missouri, in St. Louis, and how there was this whole narrative around what happened at the convenience store that he went to because the only video came out as if he was stealing. But then like a year later, another video from the convenience store came out and it's like what happened when he first came in and how like they held something for him and then they didn't want to give it back to him. So it completely changed the outlook, but it was already too late.
You know, and in all honesty, I got to be honest, some of these histories were not really presented to neither Danielle or myself in the form of a book during our quest for higher learning. It's just the facts. They were brought to light during conversations had with family members and other folks in our communities. And you will find this image floating around during our exhibition at UIS. And this is a picture of Bruce's Beach. If you have never heard of it, allow us to shed some light. It is a terrible story. So Bruce's Beach was a resort in the city of Manhattan Beach in Los Angeles County, California. It was not only owned, it was also operated by Charles and Willa Bruce. They are an African-American couple. They actually brought the parcel when it was nothing but sand dunes. And their whole inspiration for purchasing it was they wanted to provide a beach-sized leisure space for African-Americans because it was unavailable at other beach areas due to racial segregation. And everything was all good until George Lindsay, he was a real estate developer, and he decided to rid Manhattan Beach of its homeowners. So he deviously proposed tearing down the resort's buildings in order to erect a park in its place. He found some weird loophole in the Parks and Playground Act from 1909. And it basically stipulated that the government could condemn private land for civic use. Word began to spread very quickly about this tactic to take and acquire Bruce's Beach. And to make matters worse, the local KKK members began patrolling Manhattan Beach's shore and harassing not only the Bruces, but other Black residents. Many of those residents left, only a few stayed. All in all, the Bruces' property was seized in the 1920s by the Manhattan Beach City Council through eminent domain. And again, this is the right of the government to expropriate private property for public use. But as of recently, I think, October 2021, the land was actually given back to the descendants of the Bruce family after it was forcibly taken over a century ago.
Yeah.
Now, I want you all to think about this for a second. Imagine the large amounts of generational wealth that was lost, that could have been amassed by the Bruces if they were still in possession of that oceanfront property.
Yeah, so finding out about Bruce's Beach, which before I get into it is interesting because I had an aunt that lived in Hermosa Beach, which is like not too far from there. So even just kind of like growing up and going out to LA County and like visiting, you know, it would have changed even my vision of what I'm seeing in regards to this oceanfront property had I known, or had this still been something that was maybe Black owned in such a predominantly like popular area. But when we did find out about it, It inspired us to dig deeper into this pool of omitted histories. So our mentor, Glenn Rogers, disclosed that he was a descendant of the East St. Louis massacre. The stories he shared are really just like unforgettable. They're bone chilling. It's just, it's amazing. Like I can't even get into it.
It's a lot to process.
It is. It really is like what his grandmother and aunts and people went through. He informed us that his grandmother, Ruby Mae Brock, was a little girl at the time, and she survived the massacre alongside her mother, Hattie Brock. They hid in a grass field out of harm's way, and they could hear like the shots in the background, like day and night, why the murdering took place. So pictured here is a Polaroid taken at what East St. Louis has as site number 6. They have these different historical sites throughout the city. You'll miss them if you drive by them, but he showed us this one, which is located at 10th and Piggott Avenue in East St. Louis, Illinois. And this was the bridge that hundreds of Black people crossed to escape the violence during the massacre, where white rioters attempted to block the entrance, killing some. And before you move on, the bridge is now, is it just a train bridge now, or is it toned down?
I don't even know if I don't know. That's a good question.
It's either completely torn down or it's only for trains right now, but it's very like overgrown, so it was kind of difficult to access. So East St. Louis, Illinois is a city where thousands of Blacks had moved from the South to work in these factories as early as like February in 1917. So by that time, the African-American population nearly doubled, and the white workforce at the aluminum ore company went on strike during the spring while hundreds of Black people were hired. And that's when the racial tension began to fester. So rumor of an attempted robbery of a white man by an armed Black man spread throughout the city, and mobs of white people began just like beating any Black person they saw. So everything erupted on July 1st and went through July 3rd when a white man in a Ford opened fire on Black people's homes. So Black people began to gather in the area and shot into another oncoming Ford, killing 2 men, turned out to be police officers investigating the shooting. So it was a lot of chaos. The next morning, white people began beating Black people with guns, rocks, and pipes. They set fire to homes, shot up residents as they like fled from properties like that are being set on fire, set ablaze. And of course, lynchings also took place in other areas of the city. I remember just him also mentioning how someone they knew was an undertaker, like that worked in a funeral home, and just having to take all of these bodies out. And it was just overwhelming. It does come at no surprise that the plight of Black freedom movements are laced with both external and internal threats, such as in the case with the subject matter on the next slide.
You know, for this work, we called it I Am a Man. We basically recreated a poster from the protest signs used during the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers' strike. You know, the reflective nature of the Mylar that we printed on was really meant to be kind of self-affirming, you know, a mirror to oneself. However, we were kind of unaware of Ernest Withers and his role with the FBI as a paid informant. This bit of information just really shifted the piece's original meaning. By trade, Withers was a photojournalist, but his documentation was used solely to bring value to the civil rights struggle, or one could question, did he intend to provide full disclosure about these movements or any future plans? Who knows? Case in point, he was on record a paid informant. And you know, the Bureau, they keep, and when I say Bureau, I mean the FBI, they keep files on all of their informants. Finally, they declassified the files concerning Ernest Withers. And, you know, one would think that, you know, would presumably explain how much he was paid by the FBI, how he was recruited, and how long he served as an informant.
Mm-hmm.
But, we began sifting through these documents, and sometimes some of them have been acquired from, National Archives. We have our way of doing our digging. We go through other documents. We have news clippings. And this is what ultimately led us to experiment with redacted, declassified files as the subject matter itself. Now, my question is, well, who's in charge of redacting this info? What's redacted? What does this authority not want the public to know?
Right.
So you have this here picture is an actual page from a declassified file pulled from the dossier of a civil rights leader. And in regards to Withers and his FBI files, there were fully redacted, pages, much like this one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in some cases, parts of the documents were left exposed while other pertinent details were left obscure. So we had to kind of piece some of these fragments. And look, these documents can range to 800-900 pages,
right,
just for a single, file. And so we had to go through these files and kind of piece things together to kind of see a much clearer picture.
Mm-hmm. So for this work titled Black Moses, it was made around 2017, 2018. The poster utilizes fragments pulled from declassified files to showcase how the FBI, under Hoover's watch, illegally surveyed American activist Fred Hampton. So Hampton, along with other Black activists, were deemed dangerous and thereby targeted by the FBI. In Fred Hampton's case, he was often referred to as the Black Messiah in, these FBI documents. He was greatly feared because of his ability to communicate with people of various ethnicities and his robust intelligence, or intellect, I should say. He was later assassinated in his home while he was laying in his bed. So it is clear that a governing entity were not only controlling this narrative, but they were also suppressing information. So in 1982, the city of Chicago, Cook County, and the federal government agreed to a settlement in which each would pay $616,000 to a group of 9 plaintiffs, including the mothers of Hampton and Clark. For our show, we decided to exhibit works that amplify the entanglement between the FBI and Cook County Police regarding his death.
Now, we want to caution you with a trigger warning here, because you're probably going to see some things in the next slides that will upset you.
So in 2017, we have images of the KKK rally in Virginia that began to surface. We studied these images, and then we started looking back at other images from the past, similar in topic. Again, there was something about this notion of work in clusters, omitted histories, past and present, and how these things seemingly affect each other. So this is an image from the 1960s during racial segregation in the US. Images like this are derivatives of Black codes. Black codes were laws governing the conduct of African Americans. Okay, it allowed African Americans certain rights, such as legalized marriage, but it denied them the rights to testify against whites, to serve on juries, vote, or start a job without the approval of the previous employer. Could you imagine now, like, leaving your job at the university to go work at another school, and they're like, we need to follow up with your previous. I mean, some jobs do, but if your previous employer is like, nah, you can't move forward, that would like totally suck. So before the war, northern states that had prohibited slavery also enacted laws similar to the slave codes, and then later Black codes. So we have states like Connecticut, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and New York that enacted laws to discourage free Blacks from residing in those states. And then you have pig laws, were also established to unfairly penalize poor African Americans for crimes such as stealing a farm animal. So we have vagrancy statutes, made it a crime to be unemployed. I mean, literally, like, just trying to find a job, you could get locked up and just being unemployed. Many misdemeanors or trivial offenses were treated as felonies with harsh sentences and fines, which are still visibly in effect today. So we're still haunted by this kind of imagery and the racially filled hate displayed in this photo.
Unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And then here we have a modern adaptation of that previous hate crime. This incident took place at Kansas State, where a vandal tagged a car with racial slurs. The young man that owned the car eventually withdrew from college and returned to his home in California, and he sought to remain anonymous for his own safety. So there are plenty of people that have chosen to take a blind eye to the ongoing racial issues here in America. And for that reason, we decided to make a book to address just that.
So, you have these images like the ones in the previous slides, and those images were basically motivation enough to tackle this subject matter and produce what you see here. This is like almost like a children's board book, I guess.
Oh, it's one of the hardest books to make.
Difficult. We did everything, did the printing, did the binding, everything, literally.
Yeah.
And the book is titled The Obliqueness of White Supremacy. It's a little tongue-in-cheek humor in that title. And it's printed on this very thick stock. They call it butterboard. It's closer to the color of ivory. We silkscreen these images, words, racially motivated violence, in just pure stark white atop that ivory stock. Now, at first glance, under certain lighting, the image is very difficult to see. It slowly reveals itself as you bring it closer to the eye or perhaps hold it at an oblique angle. And so we're using color, material, and titling to bring awareness to America's veiled and systematic racism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've all heard the recent cries for justice concerning the Breonna Taylor verdict. I'm sure all of you know the story. Ms. Taylor was fatally shot on March 13th, 2020 by 3 plainclothes Louisville Metro Police Department officers. And they were basically executing a no-knock search warrant when they entered her apartment. And it appears that neither Breonna Taylor or Alberta Jones will receive any justice. And if you've never heard of Alberta Jones, allow us to clarify.
Mm-hmm.
Alberta Jones was a civil rights activist, and she was one of the first women to become the prosecutor in Louisville, Kentucky. She had graduated 3rd in her class from the University of Louisville and 4th in her class from Howard University School of Law. She became the first Black woman to pass the state bar exam. And she also worked as a lawyer for Muhammad Ali. As a matter of fact, she negotiated the contract for his first fight. But Jones later focused on domestic violence cases. Sadly, only a few months later, she was killed. On August 5th, 1965, Alberta Jones was pulled out of her car, beaten unconscious, and she was thrown into the Ohio River, where she drowned at only age 34. Believe it or not, people, her case is still open, and no one has ever been charged for her death. On the night of her death, Jones' mother said that her daughter had gone to meet a friend to discuss a lawsuit, but Jones never returned home. The witnesses later reported seeing the body tossed in the river by 3 men, yet still no one was charged. And sadly, as always, history has a nasty habit of repeating itself.
Mm-hmm. And for that reason, these aren't ours, first of all, but for that reason, we created a 3-color risograph poster several months ago to bring attention to the killers of Breonna Taylor. We drew inspiration from wanted posters and vintage letterpress posters. So shown here is a poster from Colby Poster Printing. And we really like the use of like that Black typography, that rainbow roll, which we've done before, but we didn't want to do for her poster. And like just that aesthetic throughout the streets of LA, and just that big block printing we really liked. So this is our 3-color risograph poster. So if you're unfamiliar with what riso, that's the abbreviation, is, risograph or riso is a stencil duplicator. So you can think of it as like a cross between screen printing and photocopying. So it has a look of screen printing or silkscreen printing, but it's actually digital. And it does it, each color at a time. So that's the thing where you kind of think about silkscreening, how you have to go like one color and then another color on top, and then the third color is last.
Thinking through layers, which I think.
Right, exactly. Versus like hitting print and it all just, sprays it down like on an inkjet or something. So we created this poster specifically with protesters in mind. And the poster bears a large type lockup, bold colors, and a potent, messaging so that it's eye-catching and easily read. And we even we had protesters reach out to us from Louisville, and we sent some of these down to them as well.
For free.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of potent messaging, does anyone know who?
Well, they can't comment, I don't think.
This man is, even though you can't comment, it's just a question.
Just raise your hand in your head.
Raise your hand.
As soon as you said, I was like, they're not going to be like me.
Right.
Okay, go ahead. So I know this is black screen. It's like when it's white and it's like this page is supposed to be blank.
Yeah, no, this is intentionally
this slide
blank.
it's supposed to be blank.
Yes.
Close your eyes.
All of you.
Yeah.
Like literally close your eyes.
And we're going to read you the poem he wrote. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolias sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. So this is by, you can open your eyes if you've closed them. This is by Abel Mirapool, also known as Lewis Allen. He was a white Jewish American writer, teacher, and songwriter. And he's the one that wrote this anti-lynching poem, Strange Fruit, in 1937, which many of you have probably heard performed by Billie Holiday and Nina Simone, and I guess Kanye, under my breath. So last trigger warning. We're almost at the end here. Thanks for staying a part of this wild ride. So again, we want to caution you with the trigger warning because the next slides will have some content that may upset you.
Oh, let me take a deep breath. So we found out later that the poem Strange Fruit was actually inspired by this iconic image. Of course, we have blurred out the bodies of the victims. And this incident took place in Marion, Indiana, which is up north. And, crowds of whites gathered to witness the lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith on August 7th, 1930. So a mob demanded that the three imprisoned men accused of a crime be turned over to them. The sheriff said, nope, can't do it. No can do. He refused. Several young men in the crowd decided to take it upon themselves to break into the jail using sledgehammers. Thomas Shipp was the first. They pulled him out, and the mob beat him and hung him out of the window bars of the jail. The crowd then dragged Abram Smith down the street to the courthouse and prepared to hang him from a large tree. When he tried to remove the noose from his neck, the mob stabbed him, broke his arms, and finally hung him. Once the mob brought Shipp's lifeless corpse over to hang next to Smith, local photographer Lawrence Beatler was called over to take the photo of the crowd and the two hanged men. For this work, it's titled Strange Fruit in Marion, Indiana. And it's very simple here. We decided to carefully redact, or as you can say, camouflage the bodies of the lynch victims. And the reason for doing it is simple. This will be shown at the exhibition. We wanted to just shift the gaze.
Lynching was a vicious form of racial terrorism in the United States, inflicted on Black people, mostly by whites. So from 1882 to 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States. Of these people that were lynched, 3,446 of them were Black. And they were lynched, accounted for about 72.7% of the people lynched, according to the NAACP, which is quick to add that not all the lynchings were ever recorded. And side note, that museum that's in Birmingham, which we haven't visited yet.
I can't think of the
They
name.
have a very chilling exhibit where all the stone or whatever, it hangs above you to kind of give you the feel of all the people that have been lost to lynchings. So it's deep. It's deep. Did you change my slide? I wasn't done talking.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry, my notes weren't done. Okay, so out of the 4,743 people lynched, 1,297 people, white people were lynched, and that's about 27%. They were lynched for like domestic crimes, like helping Black people or standing in oppression to lynching. And people would gather on Sundays and have things called picnics, which we have taught our daughter not to say the word picnic, because you can say it in your head and not out loud what people would do on Sunday and who they would go pick to hang after Sunday church.
It was a spectacle.
Unfortunately, Black people are still, haunted by these horrific atrocities from the past during the present. And again, it's rarely talked about in the news. Here's one, but I mean, this is some time ago. Or like, we'll hear about things. There were people that hung themselves,
as they say, and the family
that were part of like different protests, but their hands were bound or their pants were pulled down. You're like, how make it make sense?
And they wouldn't do any investigations.
Yeah.
So we would like to end our presentation with this powerful quote from James Baldwin. I'm prompting you to read it silently at this moment. Thank you so much.
And now we will open it to questions. Questions, comments, complaints, as I call it.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you both so much for this very powerful and sobering lecture that really sheds light on the depth of the research that you conduct to produce your artworks and your commitment to the truth in a culture that maybe isn't ready or desires to be confronted by the truth of our history. I'd like to ask you more about the process of research in your work. Just, can you speak to how you pursue it and the process of translating historical information into artworks?
Ooh. I mean, I think this has kind of been our answer for a while. This is a very intuitive process for both of us. Again, it'll start with something like a conversation with a family member. You know, for instance, your mom was telling us about the brown paper bag.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I knew something, like we had a previous show on colorism.
I didn't know anything about that, though.
Yeah, I was familiar with like the brown paper bag test, but she was telling me us like just in a random conversation about this blue vein society and things like that. And then you're just like, I'm sorry, what?
Right.
And then you just go to look it up because you're never taught, or as Black Americans, like we're not taught any of these things. And a lot of the stuff that came with African-American history dealt with protests. It dealt with slavery. It dealt with like trauma a lot, or they just really reflected on like MLK, and that was like the go-to. That's the boy, right? And I don't say that to mean that he's a boy, but you know, like that's their go-to. So a lot of the things that we do take time to research, right? Just because someone tells you something, you have to dig deeper. You can't just be like, okay, and what they said is truth. You know, there are a lot of really great documentaries that are out there, and you start to see how the information lines up. We talked about Bruce's Beach. That was one that we started to learn through Driving While Black is a documentary that was through PBS.
Yeah.
I mean, and then just kind of going from there, you know, just like the tip of the iceberg.
I feel like when we embark on that journey, like it's almost like you ask the question. It's almost you ask the universe for something.
Yeah.
And then an answer is provided. I really can't explain to you all how this works. For instance, her mom talked about, you know, the brown paper bag test. And we did some research and I was like, wait a minute, what? Danny, you knew about this? I've never heard of this.
Yeah.
That they would use a brown paper bag, and these were Black, you know, fraternities and sororities that were saying,
or just social clubs.
Or social clubs. If you're darker than this bag, you don't get to pledge, you don't gain any access. And I was like, wait a minute, what? And like my ears, everything was ringing. And then we just started to dig. And I feel like the moment we started asking questions or digging, information would just mysteriously walk into our lives. Someone got wind when I was in grad school that I was talking about the brown paper bag test. And they said, oh, wait, you know, I got something that you may want to hear. And they put me in contact with this professor at WashU, and she wrote a book all about colorism. And that took us in a whole different direction. So I feel like the moment we start asking more questions and doing research, we unearth one story. Then we'll find out about this other story. Maybe they're related, maybe not. And I think everything else just starts to bubble from there. That's the only way that we can really like answer that question.
Even the image of the lynching image where we redacted and camouflaged and took out the bodies. I told Kevin, I was like, oh yeah, that was in Indiana. Like I just knew it from something that I had learned years ago, and I couldn't remember the city, but I told him basically the whole story, and he goes to look it up, and he was like, that's exactly what happened. So
I hope that answers the question. I can't even
answer sometimes how we know these things.
I mean, the subject matter really tells us how to distill the work. We're not going to take credit for anything that we've created. We just try to tap into something that's larger than us, that's leading us through these decisions, if that makes sense. I know that's long-winded.
Thank you. Other questions? Just jump in there.
I have one. This is Aggie.
Sure. Hey,
Thank
Aggie.
you both. Thank you both for this beautiful and thoughtful presentation. I just, I don't know if this is a question so much as a comment, but the strange fruit part of the presentation where you showed the image of the lynching with the bodies redacted.
Mm-hmm.
I just, something about viewing that image, even just through the Zoom window, somehow made those bodies more present to me, the fact that they weren't there. I think because I had to imagine them for myself, and like that made me confront the history even more. I just thought I would share that. I wonder if, and I wondered if that's a single image. I guess this is my question. Is that a single image, or is that something that you anticipate being a series?
That's a good question.
I don't really want it to be a series.
Yeah.
Black trauma is hard enough.
Yeah.
You know, even just like movies that we watch, we're like, we have our own dialogue. We're like, damn, another fucking Underground Railroad movie, TV show. Like, y'all can't think of nothing
it's like
else.
They're just fixated on that
like
part of
slavery
history.
Again, massa and all this other shit. Like,
Right.
I get tired of it, right? So even with this, I mean, it's never work that's going to get sold.
Right.
But it's not really something I really want as a series. Now, unless it grows into something different, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But My immediate answer is no. I don't want it as a series.
I mean, Danielle and I had a talk about this before, Allison reached out, and I sent it to a guy that I work with at WashU. He's a printmaker. And he's like, hey man, I love to collaborate with you all. And I was like, I got this image. It's kind of disturbing, I said, now here's the caveat. We can't sell it. So I don't know how you feel about producing a one-off and doing all this work to do maybe a lithograph that we can't sell. And scale needed to be woven into that idea, and it just didn't work. We didn't want to frame a print because, then that's beautifying something that is traumatic and horrific.
Right.
So we really had to think through how to present this. A banner, it's not the prettiest thing, it's larger than life, it's a large size. You can't miss it. Redacting the bodies, being careful that you don't see them, but highlighting the rope that they're hung with. So people can see the things that they need to focus on beyond the victims.
Right.
So I don't think we'll ever do a series. And this was painful enough, just looking at that image and having to redact those bodies.
Yeah.
And knowing this other history that we didn't know until recently with, strange fruit.
By being inspired by that particular image.
So
yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
No, thank you.
Makes a lot of sense.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So for college students, for example, at UIS, how would you suggest they start having these kind of, difficult conversations? I know you guys have said like you're kind of learning still. I mean, it's, an ongoing process, but, how do you even start to tackle that, discuss that with your peers, and learn?
I think the first thing is to just do some. We are tasked with learning and unlearning at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a burden. We were taught, this small, narrow piece of history when the other side of the iceberg goes very deep. I think that we can't really suggest how people have those conversations. I think you're informed on those conversations, and you'll know how to have those conversations when you really know the history behind it. We couldn't have these conversations, say, 14 years ago. We didn't know about the HeLa sales or Henrietta Lacks or Black Wall Street. We didn't have those conversations. Danielle did, but I didn't. So it's hard for me to have those conversations without knowing kind of the backstory and the history. And I think once you know those histories, those conversations will be easier to have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, what do you think? Some of this history you already knew. I'm the one that's playing catch up.
Yeah, it also depends on your upbringing and what your parents have you reading or what, you have to do your book report on, right? And they're like, take a book home, and then you get home and your parents like, nah, we're not gonna do Of Mice and Men. Okay, you finna read this and set the record straight. So I don't know. I mean, just what he said, and it's not about having arguments, but you can't speak on something unless you have the knowledge, or at least some knowledge, or the ability to want to learn more. So as soon as you open up and start talking about it, then maybe someone else, a colleague, a student, a friend can be like, oh yeah, and then can kind of open up about something else as well. But the conversation starts when you open your mouth.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I feel bad because, I wasn't exposed to James Baldwin until a couple of years ago. That's sad. I mean, I hate to even admit that. I just didn't grow up, like my household, they didn't know about Baldwin or Zora or any of these other great critical thinkers and writers. I was not exposed to that. I certainly wasn't exposed to it in grade school or high school or most of college. No one told me about Frantz Fanon and the black skin, white mask. I discovered that on accident, right? But now that we kind of, at least for me, now that I'm being introduced, Danielle is even giving me things to read. You know, our daughter will be armed with books and knowledge, newfound knowledge, and another side of history to supplement with their pushing in the schools that they don't necessarily talk about. I know this was a very heavy presentation. It was not, you cannot tread lightly on it. It is difficult. It was difficult for us to put it together, believe me. Historically speaking, it's just like,
yeah, because I was like, you don't show that. but
I mean, to give people
to have the conversation,
and to provide proper context so they know, like, well, this is why we make it.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I have probably a related question, and that is, you mentioned trauma, and I'm speculating about your process and the research that you have to do, and the level of individual and personal trauma that is, it kind of comes with the territory. I'd be interested to hear about, as you work with these histories that are either distant or, contemporary, how you consider the viewer also in terms of trauma and maybe in relation to your own and your process. That's a lot to unpack.
That is Allison, where do we start?
I mean, one of the things I will say, with Kevin having the stronger design background, that we also make it digestible for the viewer. So for instance, okay, here's a good example. We did a visiting artist series, or maybe not series, but this visiting artist thing with the St. Louis Art Museum right before the pandemic hit. This guy, ignore it. Photoshop him out. Anyway,
I know what she's going to talk about. That's why I'm like.
And so they were like, "Oh, we want you all, we want to do. Can you design a risograph poster?" And we're like, "Yeah, of course, great. It can be on anything you want. Excellent, right?" And so we worked with a local studio that was here that we've worked with before, and kind of became colleagues with and everything. And they were printing some posters on site. Well, we draw you in with the pretty colors, the fluorescent pink and the fluorescent orange of this particular poster. It's not on this slideshow. The blues and the yellows, things that are just like draw you in, like,
to go look at it.
Donuts behind glass, right? Like pastries, right? You're like, ooh, what's this? And then we can have the conversation.
Because of the content.
And then because of the content. And then we can start talking about what's his name?
Leopold.
King Leopold III, that was like disembodying the Congolese people.
The Congolese. Yeah.
I mean, it was a massacre in itself, right?
Yeah.
And it was this know your history where people could take the poster. But like you said, it also opened up for us to have a conversation where some people are like, yo, I've heard of this, but the way that you've designed it, it's more palatable. Like I don't know. We really play with that a lot in regards to like the execution of the work for the viewer, because not everything has to like look safe or look pretty, right? We try to do things in the form of like newspapers, right? Because everything is so digital and online. We want something to be tangible for you to be able to take it with you, or some of these postcards that we're doing.
But it's not always in your face.
No, it's not.
That's the thing.
It's not like there was a show at a museum, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but it was like these huge prints, like, over the top, draping almost from the ceiling and onto the floor, and people could like walk over them. And what's printed is like these Black bodies, and then you're walking over these Black bodies, right? Or like how people have been doing like these Black Lives Matter murals in streets, right? But then psychologically, you're driving over it.
Right.
And you're like,
Right. It
doesn't really matter, so anyway, I don't want to get off subject.
It's like we're thinking through the deployment, but also we understand because of people's traumas that we have to be very careful how we present the information, because if it's too much too soon, folks will back off.
You don't give a baby meat because a baby will choke,
so
you have to give them milk.
Right, you gotta like spoon feed like little pieces, and
or let people do their own research with certain things.
Right, and that's where this show is really something different for us, because we don't give you everything.
Right,
we're actually using the thing that hurt us, these omitted histories, these fragments, redaction, and we're using redaction itself to redact all of the details, but give you some of the very specifics, right? Again, these bodies are missing. We don't have all the files, but we found these 3 files that you may need to look at.
FBI files.
It's not telling you everything, it's giving you some point of reference so you can go dig deeper. And maybe that's our way of trying to be conscientious of people's traumas, even our own. I mean, this work is not easy to make. I mean, we have to sit with these images and read these things. And I'm gonna be honest, we get pissed about it. It's like, read this, listen to this, look at this, look at what happened here. You see those bodies, you see those figures, you read these stories. It's a lot. It's a lot to distill. But a lot of those decisions are made based on the content. Not everything is for the gallery. Some things need to be dispersed to the public, which we play with this show. Some things, no, it's not an art piece for sale. We just want you to see this and think about these histories. It's in the titling of the work. It's all of these decisions.
Yeah, it's in a publication. It's on a bag. It's whatever.
Everything's different.
Yeah, I hope it's on some socks that we did. Some indigo dyed socks.
I hope that answers the question. I know that was
certainly yes. Okay. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, I think we are winding down here, and I just want to thank you both again so much for working with us at UIS for this ECCE lecture and for your exhibition, and really grateful for your time and consideration. Thanks again.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Fabulous.